Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, with a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched service capability. Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can also find the Kyndryl Institute and download the Kyndryl Institute app, where there is many of the guests that have been on the show who've written fantastic articles, all for free. You can find both at kyndryl.com, kyndryl.com, and for the Institute /Institute, or download the app. Today's guest is the world's leading expert on digital transformation. We like to call him the OG of digital transformation. He's a member of faculty at Columbia Business School and an author of 5 books and another one on the way. He is a friend of the show, and today he's with us to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of his landmark bestseller. That book was the first book on digital transformation and put the topic on the map. He defined the discipline by arguing that digital transformation, DX, is not about technology. It's about strategy, leadership, and new ways of thinking. We'll welcome back the author of Digital Transformation Playbook, Rethink Your Business, David Rogers. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Aidan. It's great to be back here. Great to be with you, and great to be talking about that book.
It's so interesting reading back. I love reading back and seeing how things played out. And you got so much right. So many things you called out. Apple valuation, the platform businesses, so much more. But I thought we'd start with what you've seen in that 10 years. What's remained the same? What's different? What's been the impact of the book, etc.?
Sure. Well, it was the impact was pretty strong. As I said, it was the first book on the topic. So as I was developing it, I've been looking at the intersection of digital technologies and how they were changing systems and markets and networks and enterprises for years. But I was trying to pull this book together about really a lot of the writing at that time was all about startups. It was like digital was seen as this new open space for the startups. And the dominant narrative out of Silicon Valley was every company that was born before the internet was just going to be gone in about a decade. Like, it's just a matter of time. They're all dinosaurs. And that wasn't really what I believed to be true from what I was seeing. So I was working on this book about what were the essential things, what would make the difference between the companies that would adapt and those that wouldn't. And I was grasping for terms, and the title came together, Digital Transformation Playbook. My publisher wanted something that really was clear in communicating. This was very practical. And then the book came out, and of course you can look at like a trend line of Google searches on the term digital transformation, and it went from practically zero to the top of the chart. So it was an experience for me as an author, timing things. It really, it was a global bestseller. It was 13 languages. I'd never had that before. And so the impact has really continued to this day. I was just in Bangalore in India with Tata Motors, actually. So biggest company in India, the biggest automaker in India. And one of their top IT executives comes up to me during the break and says, I just want to let you know that 10 years ago, I got your book, The Digital Transformation Playbook, and I was supposed to figure out what are we doing about digital. And this was my guide. I was like, okay, I'm ready now to sort of like put together our plan, our roadmap for our company. So that's been great for me personally. The impact it took me around the world over the last decade, really having a chance to advise companies in pretty much every industry, banking, insurance. Again, 10 years ago, there was still an argument, well, does digital affect us, right? I don't get that argument, depending what kind of business you're in. It's the banks, insurance, industrial businesses, steel manufacturers, mining companies, automotive, consumer goods. They've all gone on this journey. And obviously they were forced, if you will. They're on the journey because of what was going on in technology and the environment. But I think in terms of the impact, that's what I've been most gratified is the folks who have said, I love it when they bring me in to advise them, obviously, on a particular strategic question or on ironing out the next stage of their roadmap. But I really love it when they just tell me, hey, I read your book and like, here's all these ideas I got and here's what I did just on my own.
I was telling you, David, off air, and I was telling you last time we spoke that the book was so valuable for me in my role. And I wish I had it earlier, because I started that journey in 2009, and there was so much that you'd spelled out, and then came the roadmap, your follow-up book, and it really did simplify the thing. I would highly, highly recommend it. And it's one of the top listened to shows we've ever had on the show as well, just so you know. So it's very, very well received.
I'm glad to hear. It was a great show. I really love your show across the range of guests and topics. But when I'm sharing some of the interviews, examples of works of mine, yours is one of my favorite interviews to share with others, because we really got into about the sequel, if you will, that interview about the roadmap.
One of the things that we talked about was what's changed and what's remained the same. That quote, more things change, more they remain the same. Lots have stayed the same. Impacts were slower in some cases, faster in others. But AI comes along, and I know you're writing a new book with the theme of AI. And I was thinking about this before we came on air. When you talk about digital transformation or digitalization, a lot of people now throw AI in that bucket, and they're both right and wrong. And I'd love you to correct us on that, or give us your version of that.
Sure. My version of that big picture is that digital transformation was not a response to one change, right? That was an early misconception. It was like, oh, the internet landed, and there was a bunch of change between maybe whatever, 94 and 98 or something. And now we're just orienting our companies. And this was this mindset, we're at a new plateau, a new steady state. And so companies think, we're going to spend a couple of years, we're going to do this transformation thing, and then we'll be set. And that's not at all what happened. If you look at the history of the last 25 years, 30 years going on now, is that it's been a successive one wave of digital change after another that has built on each other, right? First, we had the internet. Then we had social media, interactive media. Then we had streaming content. Then we had the smartphone, mobile computing revolution. Then we had cloud computing, Internet of Things, blockchain. Each one couldn't really happen without what came before. Each one has brought in new winners, new losers, totally transformed industries. So the point is, things never actually stopped. They keep building and accelerating. AI did not start in 2023, right? AI it's been a field of research and study for about 70 years. But the first big, really practical breakthrough was around artificial neural networks over a decade ago. That led to actually a lot of value creation, a lot of business application. The thing was, at that stage, machine learning was a very highly technical topic. So it was really a domain of experts. So most people, even inside the companies using it, didn't know, meaning the company was using it. Most employees didn't even know, like, oh, what are we doing with AI? That was like a very technical concept. Now, because of these consumer-facing tools, everyone thinks they know what AI is. So and it's true, it is a whole nother wave of change. The LLMs and related technologies have sparked. This is the biggest thing happening right now in terms of the latest digital wave of change, going to disrupt businesses, going to create new opportunities, new winners and losers. Really requires transformation, and requires companies that are willing to rethink the boundaries and the definition of the business they're in, and really redesign their organizational structures around it. So the challenge, the hard part, as I always say, is yet again transformation. Not to downplay the technology at all, but it is the most important technology today, building on a series of technologies. And my bet is 10 years from now, at least if we're talking about sort of LLMs and the current era of AI, we'll be talking about that in the past tense. And everyone's going to be obsessing about the thing that then built upon that.
Looking forward to it, David, as well. And the more you read this stuff, the more confidence it gives you, which is why I do the show. You're always very, very generous with frameworks that you give away, both in the book and then on your own website that we'll share later on. Some of the frameworks I'd love to touch on today: the platform business models, co-opetition, and one of the really interesting things right at the end of the book, you sneak in your own theory, updated theory of disruption, updating the work of Clayton Christensen, which is fascinating as well. So that's all ahead. But I'd love to start with the fascinating story of Encyclopedia Britannica. I have still in my family home, those Britannicas are there. I still remember doing college projects and going through them. And now it's totally changed. Wikipedia, Encarta. I remember the disc of Encarta when it first came out.
Yeah.
And the story is the dinosaur gets wiped out, but that's not the case for Britannica. And it's beautiful to tell these stories.
Yeah. So in the United States, if you're old enough, I'm barely old enough, there's a famous image of a newspaper headline. It's President Harry S. Truman holding up a newspaper that says Dewey wins. Thomas Dewey was running, I think it was Thomas, somebody Dewey was running against a Truman, who was the incumbent president for re-election. And it was a close race. And this was before the days of incredible statistical models and predictions and pollings and coming down to the hour and what we're used to seeing on election night. So in that era, this newspaper got it wrong, and because it was looking like Dewey was going to win, and they just went ahead and printed the headline. And so Truman famously was gloating. He's like, "Ha, you thought I was going to lose." Well, that's what happened with Encyclopedia Britannica. It was at a certain time, it became this wrong headline about digital transformation. People had been going around at conferences and they were trying to scare incumbents by saying, look, worst case scenario, what's going to happen to you if you don't change? And they would typically talk about Blockbuster, and they would talk about Kodak. Kodak was a little older, of course, failing to adapt to the shift to digital photography, Blockbuster failing to respond. And I tell that story in a little detail in the book. And it wasn't illogical. It was just myopic, which is the classic problem of leadership. You're looking at the business of today and, more importantly, yesterday, rather than looking ahead to where things are going. So in this case, people suddenly started talking about Britannica as yet another example of a classic stalwart business that had been disrupted by the internet. And at first I thought, oh, that's interesting. But I dug into it a little bit, right? And it turned out the dinosaur was still alive and kicking. This was completely misconstrued, right? What changed, which was worth a headline, and I'm sure that was the original headline, was that they had stopped printing the books. And that was a culturally noteworthy moment. 244 years they had been publishing a version of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It had grown over the years. That was the old idea. Pre-internet, you just keep adding another page to each section every year, and the editions got bigger and bigger. It was 30 leather-bound volumes. But of course, with the digital era, the world had moved on, was not really sustainable as a business model. And so they announced that they were no longer printing it. But the fascinating thing was that the company actually managed to survive. And so I lay out in the book the story of how they made one pivot, one change after another, because it wasn't even just one wave of change. At that point, everybody said, oh yeah, Wikipedia disrupted Encyclopedia Britannica because that was the current, at that moment, the digital equivalent. But it had even started sooner than that. So I talk about the different stages, how they had responded and adapted, and really what kept them going, which was not at all obvious, which is that they understood who their customer was. And most importantly, they understood who their most important customers were. And this is a key principle I talk about in the final chapter about disruption. When you're truly facing and you recognize you are truly facing a seriously disruptive threat, one of the strategies you can deploy is to identify, is there a defensible position in the market? Smaller position, but double down on that. Entrench yourself there and build out. And that's what they did. So their core customers was not, bless you, Aidan and your family. There were lots of families who did have the encyclopedia at home, but most families didn't. Their most important customers were actually schools, right? School librarians and school teachers. And so they reinvented, and this is the other key idea, which comes up very much in the book, is about reinventing your value proposition. So they really did a good job of saying, why are we useful? What problems are we solving for these teachers in the classroom, trying to educate young people, for the librarians and so forth? And how can we do that better? And how can we not just keep solving the problems we did in the past? Because guess what? Maybe Wikipedia does a lot of that well, right? How do we figure out what are the new problems, the new challenges they're facing, the new things they would like to do for their students, where our expertise and our reputation, that combination, our skills and our market relationships would allow us to do it well. And so they reinvented themselves as a paywalled, paid, and they've continued to change. But at the sort of critical moment when they shut down the paper edition, they were focusing primarily on a paid subscription service that had a lot of educational tools in addition to just the content. And that was really what allowed them to navigate through this incredible period of pressure and come out the other side. And they're still today an active business. So it was a remarkable story. And I used to give that speech and people's eyes would light up. They're like, really? They're still around? And they're all griping about how their desktop computer business or their professional services business or their teleco company is having trouble. And I'd say, look, if these guys can transform, you can too. It's possible. And that is really the core message of the book.
I loved thinking about that, literally like a dinosaur. And I'm like, they're just now an alligator. They've right-sized for the environment.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. Exactly. They evolved into an alligator and found a healthy swamp to say hey, we've got a new home. Yeah.
Exactly. Or as Rita McGrath, our mutual friend, would say, arena, not a swamp.
Yes. They found the right arena to compete in. Exactly.
I'm going to throw this out now. I don't think we're going to get to it. There's 5 key domains in the book of digital transformation: customers, competition, data, innovation, and value. We'll touch on them, but I really wanted to make today about some of the tools that we could provide. Because you mentioned disruption, I'm going to jump right to the end of the book and my notes. And let's share, firstly, the evolution of the theory, because you go right back to Schumpeter, you go to Clayton Christensen, and then you go, that's the background, here's my version. And then we might share the tool as the first tool. Reverse how the book, and probably how you usually did interviews on this one.
So disruption, in a sense, is an idea that's been around for a long time. Joseph Schumpeter was a famous economist who wrote about it under a different term. He used the phrase creative destruction. And he was looking at this process through which, as he saw it, capitalism inevitably leads to one success, leads to breaking down old systems, old what we would call business models, old sort of economic models, that they're inherently unstable, right? That the new one will come along and break apart the old and make it no longer viable and replace it. And he looked at that at a sort of a macroeconomic level and things like a shift from an agrarian society to an industrial society and so forth. Now, Clayton Christensen came along with a much more specific, a very powerful theory in the 1990s that he developed called disruptive. Well, when he first wrote it, it was about disruptive technologies, and then he redefined it or calibrated it as disruptive innovation. And this was a really powerful tool for understanding a lot of what was going on, why companies, in some cases, but not all, were facing challengers that they seemed unable to respond to. And in the classic Christensen model, what happens is the challenger comes in with a cheaper, worse version of your product or service. Right? And that's part of why it's difficult to respond, because it doesn't even look like a threat. And more specifically, and this is, I think, to me, the most enduring insight of Christensen, the reason why you don't respond is because your current customers are not interested, right? And so we have to be careful about customer centricity, right? When we talk about customer centricity, which is, of course, essential for every business, focusing on the customer. One thing you do have to be mindful of is, of course, you should focus on your current customers once you're an established business. But somewhere in the organization, you have to have people whose job is actually to not think about the current customer, right? And to have a different focus and be thinking about people who are not your customer and what do they need? And obviously, that's not the primary focus of your business in the moment. But most companies are not set up that way. And so they say, look, this new version, this new product is kind of crappy. It doesn't work. It's not as fast or as cheap or whatever. It's not as good. Actually, it's more performance. It doesn't perform as well as what we have. So our current customers don't want it. But in the Christensen model, it is either cheaper or it is more accessible. Think of on demand, think of online rather than in a physical store. Some reason why it's easier to get access to. And so what happens is it doesn't take your current customers. It takes these other customers you're not caring about. And these were folks who could never use your product, right? And so again, that gives it room to start building while again, you're feeling unthreatened and you're not paying attention. But the point is that any product tends to, running business is successful, performance will improve over time. And this is the second insight of Christensen is the incumbent keeps making their product better and better. And it's nice to have the additional performance or whatever, but it's not essential, right? It's sort of like, oh, a little extra gravy for the current customer. Now this weaker, but maybe cheaper version or solution also gets gradually better and better until a tipping point when suddenly it's good enough that your core customer starts saying, hey, that doesn't suck as much anymore. Like maybe we could use that at least for some of our jobs because it sure would save us money. Let's at least do some pilots, and they find it works pretty well. And then they start using more. And then you have this rapid departure of customers. So he laid this out really elegantly. It's a great theory. The problem was it was developed, what I would say looking back, or it's not a problem. It's a great theory for many cases, but the limitations of the theory is it is really focused on and was derived from analyzing B2B sales and B2B marketing. That's an era of technology and grew out of it. So I came with again, not really just what I would call my model, what I call a business model theory of disruption is an expansion. It tries to explain more than what the Christensen model does.
In my notes here, I have your definition as written in the book, and you write as follows: business disruption happens when an existing industry faces a challenger that offers far greater value to the customer in a way that existing firms cannot compete with directly. There's a lot of unpacking in there, and I'd love you to unpack it.
Sure. Well, first of all, we are talking about business disruption because the phrase disruption at some point became something that was corrupt to use talking about everything. And the other next key point is this is about an existing industry. So people started to equate disruption with innovation. If something is innovative, if it's new and valuable, it's disruptive. And they actually mean two different things. I think that was because it was good in a certain era to put it in your pitch deck. Investors wanted to see that you were disruptive. But disruption means you have some existing industry. It's really not about whether your business is going to succeed or not, right? It's about in succeeding, will it wind up breaking apart an existing business model, right? Invalidating it. So you've got to have an existing industry, and the new entrant has to do two things. It has to offer far greater value, not like incrementally better, right? Then you get in the typical sort of arms race of like, okay, we'll add a feature, you add a feature, you'll add more to your sales force, we'll hire more people for our sales force, we'll reduce our price. That's standard competition. It has to come in like the difference between a digital camera and a print camera, right? Now, some customers might say, I prefer the film camera. But there's no question that for many customers and in many situations, the digital camera, it's like the number of pictures you can take. It's not 10% or 20% more. It's like 100 times or 1,000 times more. So it's like far greater value. That's the key here, sort of this qualitative difference in value to the customer. And then the second, there's some reason why you cannot, as the incumbent, simply compete directly. Why you can't just say, okay, great, we're adding that to our lineup as is and roll out one of those. That to me is the essence of what the phrase disruption has come to mean in the digital era. And so what I wanted to do in this chapter was to really, with this theory, is to figure out how do we anticipate that? How do we know if we're really in that hot water? Because guess what? Christensen got it wrong, for example. He was asked when the iPhone came out whether it was going to disrupt Nokia. Nokia was the dominant mobile phone player at the time. And he gave a categorical no. He said no. And he explained quite correctly why his theory predicted that Nokia would defeat Apple. But that was simply because the iPhone did not fit that theory. And so again, how do we anticipate all these circumstances where this outside threat is going to have that level of impact on us? And that was, so my goal in the book was A, to correctly predict it, and B, lay out what are your options to respond if that should happen.
So if you're intrigued, pay attention to us now. I'm going to share one of the tools, two elements of this tool. So David has the disruptive business model map in the book, and I'm going to share it on the screen. Join us on YouTube if you will, and I'll share in the link to David's website. Just sign up for his newsletter and you can get access to these tools. So I'm going to share on the screen now the Disruptive Business Model Map, which is extremely useful. It makes you think totally differently about it.
As you can see, we start with who's the challenger. You're going to define who's the challenger, who's the incumbent, right? This is all about the interaction between them. And just as important, you have to define the customer. Who is the customer that they are competing over here, right? And then with that, you look at two critical variables, if you will. So one is the value proposition. What is the difference in value proposition between what the incumbent has been offering and what the challenger is now offering, right? So I call that the differential. And I have a set of what I call generatives to look at what are the ways that sometimes challengers will come in and create, again, the value proposition can't be a little bit better. It can't be incrementally better. It has to be dramatically better. And so I lay out some examples of why, but that's the first test. Does it create a value proposition that for this customer is dramatically greater, right? And then the second test is on the other side, what I call the value network. And these are all the things in your business model that go into delivering that value proposition. That maybe it's data, maybe it's partnerships, maybe it's distribution, maybe it's physical manufacturing assets, people, talent, IP, brand, all the things that are required that have to come together to deliver this offering to the market, right? That is what is called, in academic theory, a value network, right? So you look at the two. What's the value network of the incumbent? What's the value network of the challenger, right? And when you see what does it take to deliver this new offering, the digital camera, the iPhone experience, right? Whatever it is, what are the things that allow this company to do it? And then the two-part test, right? Does the challenger's value proposition radically surpass or displace in some cases, because it's the value of the incumbent, right? It just makes it irrelevant. And then second, is in the value network, is there a barrier to imitation? And in every one of these cases, whether it's Apple against Nokia, whether it's Netflix against Blockbuster, time after time, there is something in the value network of the challenger that the incumbent does not have. They don't have that critical ingredient. They can't get it. There's some reason why they can't just say, oh, okay, we'll put that in production and we'll deliver the same offering to the customer. And that is where you find yourself in the trial. So that is what this tool does. It helps you to truly assess, is this competition or is this really disruption that we're facing?
It's a fantastic tool, and I'm sure many people will be intrigued to go, am I in there? And I was talking, when we did a long form series on Clayton Christensen's work, and I had the honor to speak with Matt Christensen, who's Clayton's son. He came to Dublin especially to record with us. And he told me that he's responsible for the investment firm that specifically looks for disruptive innovation theory businesses. So when they qualify for this, and he was saying one of the things they actually look for is, did the incumbent look at you and go, not worth thinking about those guys, they're not a threat. And that's actually like a trigger point. And they go, yes, tick the box for that one. But on the flip side, then you offer a new tool here. So if you do feel the breeze at your heels, Schumpeter's gale blowing behind you, there's the Disruptive Response Planner. So I'm going to share this on the screen next, and I'd love you to take us through this one.
So this is, again, the second tool. This is if you assess you are facing a disruptive threat, what can we do about it? And it starts with analyzing three key variables about the nature of this threat that's coming at you. So the first is what I call the customer trajectory. So in the classic Christensen model, there's only one way this happens. It is outside in. So that means the challenger is going after customers outside your current market, and then hoping to, over time, work their way in. Is that the trajectory, though, or is it inside out? And this is an example where the iPhone was the case, right? Very few people were buying an iPhone who didn't already have a mobile phone, right? When you think of Netflix, when they arose, when they're challenging Blockbuster initially, the people who were using Netflix had all used Blockbuster. So this is actually the reverse. In this case, the challenger is starting right at some subsegment, maybe not all of your current customers, but some of your current customers and then looking to get a foothold and expand out. You also want to ask, okay, which customers are adopting this first, even if it's just a few, who are those early adopters? What is going to be next and what are going to be the triggers, right? Right now, it may be most customers are not interested, but what's the reason? What would make the difference? What should you be concerned about? Hey, if this challenger can solve this problem or address this issue, all of a sudden more of my customers would be interested. So that's all about gaming out the customer trajectory. So the second box is the disruptive scope, because there's this common myth that whenever disruption happens, it takes over the entire market. The old model is just gone. It's like the horse and buggy, and then automobiles come along. And I actually talk about that in the book and some of the interesting history of that. But okay, automobiles took 99.999% of the market. In North America today, you have to go to Central Park if you want to ride in a horse and buggy. Most disruption doesn't actually happen that way. So that's a misperception. You see this starting to happen. You say, oh, the gig is up. There's nothing left for us, or let's just fight on every front. So instead, you want to figure out what are the use cases for the customer where the disruptor is so much more valuable. Because sometimes it is in some cases, but in other situations, the old version is actually better, right? You want to look at customer segments, right? Other times it has to do with who the customers are. You have certain segments who will immediately gravitate towards and prefer the new offering, but other segments who, for very logical reasons, prefer the incumbent, right? And then you want to look at network effects, right? Is this going to happen on a sort of customer by customer basis? Or because of same side or cross side network effects, are you going to see that as more and more start to adopt the new challenger, everyone else is going to be dragged along through the network effects? The third thing is you want to look at, are there other incumbents besides yourself who are facing the same challenge? And I walk through how to identify them and what disruption they might be facing through looking at their value chain, looking at substitution dynamics, looking at laddering. And then once you understand these three kind of dimensions, if you will, you can figure out what responses may or may not be available to you. And so I lay out 6 in the book. 3 of them are variations on how do you become the disruptor yourself. And 3 of them are variations. And basically, if you can do that, you start with one of those. But in many cases, none of those are available, and you assess that. And if so, the other 3 are about mitigating your losses through refocusing, through diversifying, or through a fast and orderly exit. And so that's the sort of 6 responses we've got here. And again, the point of the tool is when you face a disruptor, it's not just a matter of denial, and then say, well, nothing to be done. You should identify early, you should develop a strategic response, and you should get to work on it.
David, one of the things I try and do in the show is make sure everybody's on the same page. So there was a couple of terms you used there, and you go deep into them in the book, and I highly recommend the book for bringing yourself up to speed with the language of disruption and digital transformation language. But you mentioned not just network effect, but same side and cross side. And I thought just maybe we'd share that very briefly.
So we often think about network effects generically, and it's some kind of a snowball effect that as a company starts to grow, it builds momentum, or as it acquires customers, it's easier to get the next customer. But in actual fact, if you really understand these are what we call platform business models, there's 2 different kinds of network effects. So one is called same side network effects. So that is the more customers of one kind you attract or acquire, the easier it is to get the next one, because the next one actually you give more value because there's more customers like them. So a classic example of that is any kind of communication network. The first fax machine, when there was only one person with a fax machine, was no use. When you had 2 people with a fax machine, okay, 2 people can use it. When you've got 10% of all businesses have one, it starts to become valuable. We see this in Facebook. We see this in all the social networks. The more people you know, every time you learn about whatever it is, Blue Sky was maybe the latest that was communication-based network where I looked on and say, is this worth my time? And of course, one of the first questions is, of the people I want to connect with or follow or communicate with, how many of them are already there? It could be the best tool in the world, but if it's a communication tool, the people I want to communicate with aren't there, that's not helpful. So that's same side. It's like me and other people like me. But there's another kind which we call cross-side network effects. And so that's when a platform business is based on exchanging value between different parties. So a classic pre-digital example of this is something like a credit card, but you see it in the digital economy as well with something like any kind of payment platform, whether it's WeChat, Venmo, or PayPal, or whatever it is. You've got like businesses and individuals, right? So whether you're bringing in your credit card or whether you're thinking about, do I sign up for WeChat Pay? You as an individual want to know, well, how many businesses are going to accept this payment? And the business wants to know, well, how many customers are going to ask to use this payment? Is it worth me going to the trouble to install it? Another common example that we're all familiar with is ride hailing. So every time Uber was trying to move into a new market, it faced two simultaneous challenges. The riders would only download the app and try it if they knew there was a certain number of drivers in their city. It doesn't matter how many Uber drivers there are in the world. I want to know, in this city, are there many Uber drivers? But at the same time, the drivers, they don't care about how many drivers they are. They care about how many riders are out there. Like, do I want to use this app, or am I really going to get many additional rides per day? And so you have to manage as a business. The strategy of how do you grow is actually different if you're dealing with same side versus cross side. Both can be done, but it's a different strategy to make it work. And again, backing to the disruption scenario, either one can be a threat, but you want to understand what's happening with this challenger who's coming in to understand, hey, can I effectively respond and in which way?
Fantastic. I was thinking about, I've tried so hard in vain to get people to use Signal instead of WhatsApp because I don't like Meta as a business, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen I bet you've seen it, Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he eventually gets to the final scene where there's like a knight protecting the Ark of the Covenant, and he's atrophied and he can barely carry his sword. And I always have that as this metaphor of me waiting for people to join me.
In the promised land of Signal.
Yeah, it's really annoying. Yeah. It's like, this is again, when you talk about this, it's like there's often one winner and that winner wins big, and there's small losers then, or people might be able to make some business model out of it, but it's very, very difficult if you've lost the race. So David talks about that deeply as well. But let's talk about platforms, because I'm going to do a deep dive into platforms actually coming soon. We'll have all the goats of platform strategy coming onto the show. We're going to do a platform series. But
excellent.
There's a couple of things you mentioned there. You mentioned competition. And in the book, you talk about you have to think differently about competition, especially as a platform business. If you're an Apple, if you're a Google, even though you're frenemies. And another guest we have coming on the show, you mentioned him in the book, Barry Nailbuff, who wrote the book Co-opetition. He's coming onto the show in a few months' time as well. But maybe we'll just say a word on competition and the changing nature of that, because people who before you would have actually tried to kill as an enemy, now you have to embrace them even if you don't want to.
Yeah, well, in the first chapter of the book, I lay out kind of some of the fundamental kind of mindset shifts that we have to make as leaders in these 5 domains, thinking differently about our business in terms of customers, thinking differently about our competition, thinking differently about the way we use data, thinking differently about our approach to innovation, and thinking differently about our value proposition. So the kind of big shift in thinking that I have seen is required in the digital era around competition. So one is we're shifting from thinking about defined industries, which was the old way of thinking. I am a telco company, so I compete with other telco companies. I am a handset manufacturer, so I compete with handset manufacturers. Well, Apple's a computer company. They're not a competitor. Another is that we used to think there was a clear distinction between partners and rivals. And therefore competition is a zero-sum game, right? Where it's all about I win, you lose. We're fighting over things like market share, right? And by contrast, what I see today is we have this blurred distinction between partners and rivals. And competitors have to learn to cooperate with each other in key areas. And this is, I take the term from Barry Naliboff of a co-opetition to describe this, is how do we manage, I talk about that the locus of competition is shifted from, yes, we still compete with those directly who are just like us, right? But actually the harder job is how do we manage these relationships with companies with whom we both compete and cooperate? Those are the much more dynamic and ultimately to our success or failure, the more important relationships, I would say, to work out. And you look at how digital native companies are really used to this, Google and Apple, and that was a classic early example because they were duking it out for supremacy in the smartphone world, Android versus iOS. But at the same time, Google was paying billions of dollars to Apple to be on the iPhone with their search business. So a lot of old-fashioned companies would never have done that. Walmart, and I'm not saying they're wrong, but Walmart to this day will never put anything of theirs on Amazon Web Services. They don't compete with them in the area of cloud computing, but they're like, you're our competitor in retail. We're not going to give you our stuff. We're going to work with Google. That is the old way of thinking, whereas the digital-born companies that have really gotten to scale are willing to engage in these kind of three-dimensional chess, if you will, relationships with other businesses where they're competing and partnering at the same time. Other sort of the last other things, one is you're thinking about what I call asymmetric competition as well as symmetric. So that's, again, this distinction between competing with another company who is offering sort of an equivalent product in the market versus competing with a company who has a totally different business model than you, but that may impact the relevance of your product in the market. So think of a car manufacturer versus a ride-hailing service, right? Or a Waymo, for example, as a service. And for the user, ultimately, all I want is transportation. And so you are competing. Whereas in the old way of thinking, you'd say, well, the product is different. We make cars, they don't, so we're not competitors. So thinking about asymmetric competition. And lastly, which sort of connects a lot of these themes, is the whole dominance of platform business models. So I talk in great detail in that chapter about understanding what is and is not a platform business model, because that is the other term, I would say, as much as disruption, that has just come to be used to mean anything that's digital. And that's absolutely not what it means. People for years have been calling Netflix and listing it among digital platforms because it's digital and I use it on my phone, so it must be a platform. It is not. Tesla is not a platform business model, right? Some companies are and some are not. So I lay out what actually is a platform business model and what makes them different. And some of those things make it challenging to build one. Some takeaway is it's not the only way to build a successful digital business. It's probably one of the harder ways to get started, right? If you're pursuing a platform business model, there are more things you have to get right up front. But when you succeed, you will be able to, or if you succeed, you will be able to grow faster and in many cases be harder to attack. You'll be more defensible and more dominant. And so we really look in the chapter about those kind of key strategic questions to understand how do we think about platforms in a way that's going to benefit our own business.
Beautiful. You've teed me up perfectly for two things. One, I have a slide on the 4 types of platform business, so that will help people get some clarity. And then you have a brilliant tool, another one of these great tools that you offer in the book about the platform business model, which helps you answer questions like who are the platform's key customers, what is the role or value contribution of each customer type, what draws each party to the platform, and how does the platform monetize. It was so helpful to read that, and I'd love to share both those tools before we run out of time, David, as usual.
Yeah, so the 4 types of platforms, and I want to be clear looking back, this was not meant to be and is not a definitive or a complete list. This is starting from the definition, which I offer, which is a platform is any business that creates value by facilitating direct interaction between 2 or more distinct types of customers. right? So you need two different types of customers who have some different role to play, right? And it's this really interesting in-between space. You don't just buy things from A and then resell it to B, because then A and B have no direct interaction, right? So this is why it is a direct interaction between the two. Think of me. Look, I'm traveling to Europe next week. I have an Airbnb. I go on that service. I am actually interacting with the person who owns the property. So that direct interaction, right? But the platform is facilitated, right? The platform is not background architecture. It's not my Comcast, my internet company or something where it's just in the background. It is defining that experience. It is providing certain choke points, setting rules, ensuring different parties so that we feel safe and so forth. So it's this interesting balance of the business model is both defining, shaping the experience, creating the terms, but also not dictating everything, is allowing this interaction between parties. That's what makes it a platform. Now, with that definition, because that can sound a bit abstract, what I point to is, look, 95, the majority of companies who you see of this type fit into one of four categories. So this is where we commonly see them. One is what I call an exchange, right? And so that would be something like a dating website, right? A product marketplace like eBay or Etsy, right? A service marketplace like Airbnb. And so you've got these sort of buyers and sellers of some kind of good or service working through the platform. Lots of these businesses operate that way. Another would be a financial transaction system. So this is digital payment systems, digital currencies. And many of these cases, you see a digital equivalent of the old credit card model, where you have an issuer of credit, right? That's typically a bank. You've got a merchant who's the business accepting your payment. You've got the card holder or the account holder, the payer, who's the consumer, so to speak. So you actually have three different parties, right? So it's not always two, right? It's two or more distinct parties. So in this case, you've got three different parties you have to bring together, right? A third common one we see all the time is ad-supported media. And this is sometimes we don't even think about this as being a platform business model, but it absolutely is. So this is any website with advertisements. This is Google search, for example, right? The business model is based on bringing together two things: the advertiser, who is sponsoring some subset, a minority of the search results, with some of them, and then the person who's searching. And Google has to meet the needs of both of them, right? Because if it's not a great search engine and people aren't using it, no advertiser is going to show up. But if you don't have any advertisers, if you had no way to monetize, or if the people you attracted were somehow not of interest to your advertisers, then you couldn't afford to keep running the business, right? So this is the digital age equivalent of things like newspapers from before. And the fourth sort of common category here is what I call a hardware or software standard. And these are most well-known in the digital era, the mobile operating systems. So the incredible success of something like iOS as the operating system for the iPhone, or Android, in each case bringing together developers, right, as one key party, the phone users, right? And in the case of Android, there's a third party, which is the handset manufacturers. Now, Apple's case, they keep that inside. So they only have two distinct customer types. Android, there's three distinct customer types. Each one, again, you've got to facilitate the value exchange between each of them. So those are the four I have seen. In your sense, some hybrids commonly, some company examples that sort of mix a bit of this or that. But most platform business models fit in those four buckets. So I find it a helpful way to think about this in a concrete sense. Where do I most commonly see this kind of business?
So let's segue straight into it because of time. The platform business model map. And unfortunately, you use Facebook here. Neither of us really like this company, and like them even less since you wrote the book, I have to say. But it's a useful model to understand, and this is a good way. And to bear in mind as well, this was over 10 years ago, and the business model has changed a little bit, and there's been some more additions just like any platform business, they have opportunities to buy and acquire and add new elements to it as well. Not the metaverse, let's say.
Yes. Yeah. And again, this is a tool to answer questions, right? So that's why I want to take it here, not as a way of understanding where was Facebook in 2016, 2015, 2014. But as you can see here, it's a visual business model mapping tool that is built on this principle. At the center, you have a platform business model. And maybe this is one you're imagining and you're scheming, you're dreaming up, or maybe this is a current threat, a competitor, someone you're trying to analyze, an existing business model. But you've got the platform, and then around it, you have two or more distinct customer types. So you're identifying which ones there are. And then you see these arrows going back and forth. That is all about the value exchange. So with each customer type, you want to understand what value are they getting from the experience you offer, and what value are you capturing back from them. And another sort of dimension here is the value flowing through you, right? Is the user getting a benefit that is actually provided by you or by other users, or maybe by someone like an app developer, right? The advertiser is not creating a lot of value in a media platform typically that the user cares about, but the user is creating a lot of value the advertiser cares about. So these things aren't always reciprocal in that sense. But the whole key here, why you need to draw this out and why it's so critical, is there are a lot of things you've got to get right to make a platform business model succeed. And so I just want to recap the key questions using this tool will walk you through is, first of all, who are the customers that are going to be essential to making this work? How will you monetize, right? At what point, you'll notice most of these arrows are not about monetary value, right? Which ones are? What are the points? Which customers, where is someone going to pay, right? How will you monetize it? Understanding the network effects, which customers have network effects that across what we call cross-side network effects, they're pulling in that other customer type. Which customers have same-side network effects, meaning they attract more of themselves, more of the same kind of customers, right? That will help you figure out who are your most important customers. Because if you have 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 different customer types and you're trying to get started, you've got to figure out, well, is someone what I call the linchpin? That's the customer type where as long as you really make them happy and you're attracting them, the others will start to follow, right? You need to know that. And lastly, the whole thing requires that your business model, what I call, has to be in balance. And what that means is each customer type has 2 things. They have got to receive enough value that you're going to attract, right? And very often this is the mistake, right? You've got to have a compelling enough value proposition to really draw them in. But you also have to make sure that they are contributing something, right? Again, most of the value here is passing through you as the platform. So they've got to be bringing something in, some value, some data, some eyeballs, some product or service they're bringing. There's lots of different ways that a party can bring in value, but you want to make sure for each one, there's this kind of balance. There's enough value that it's worth their time and effort, but there's also enough value that they're bringing that you can afford to chase them down and market to them and really get them onto your platform. And that's why I've seen, again, platform business models can take 100 different shapes and forms, but those are the questions that always are critical to success. And so the point of this tool is to help you understand what are going to be those critical success drivers for your own particular business model.
Such a brilliantly useful tool as well. And even if you're not going to use these, it challenges you to think differently about your own business. It made me think about the innovation show slightly different, to think about the different elements. And one person I was forgetting about with the whole value proposition is the publisher. So if you have new books, for example, you're helping out a publisher by actually bringing on the show, because I always focused on the guest. And actually, it makes it really useful to actually just drive your thinking a little bit more. We're running out of time, and there was one tool I just couldn't let you go without sharing. It was so useful, and one that you don't hear enough of, which was Value Train. And
Hmm.
in the book, you talk about value train, but you do an analysis of HBO Go, and it's useful for people who understand that business model. Maybe you'll give us a quick rendition of what a value train is, and then I'll show as our last tool the value train analysis of HBO.
Well, so value train is a concept I introduced in this book, and it is not, to clarify, a value chain, which is more of an enterprise question. What are all the competencies that we need to bring to bear, and which do we have inside and outside the company? The value train looks at a given offering, a specific offering, value proposition to a customer. And it asks, how do we get there? And so you actually start with the customer. That's the last car in the train, so to speak. And then you go backwards. And there's typically different parties at different steps. And it depends on the industry. But classically, there's usually some kind of final distributor, if you will, who's the one who touches the customer and hands off whatever that service is. In many cases, you have a producer who puts together the final product or service who might not be the distributor. And then you may have other upstream sort of originators of key components and so forth that go into it. So that's the analytical tool. And the point here is of doing this is to understand how is our business model, how is our sort of our industry, because this is often not just you, it's you and the other companies you work with. How are we currently constructed? How do we currently coordinate to ultimately deliver this service or this product to the user? And how might that change? So it's really helpful when new entrants are coming in, when someone is trying to intermediate or disintermediate you, and understanding what is the threat, is it a threat, can you cooperate with them, how do you respond, and so forth. And so it's both to respond to others, but it's also a great tool for gaming out, hey, maybe we want to change the rules of the game. What if we want to, for example, go direct to customers? And so one of the cases that I lay out, which was a wonderful case when it happened to learn from, and still is today, was HBO. And the interesting thing here is HBO was facing a clear challenge, which was Netflix had arrived, had proven a demand for streaming media, and consumers obviously wanted it. Now, some people who didn't know the business very well would say, well, gee, why doesn't HBO do this? They're so stuck in the mud. They're just old-fashioned. They should have a streaming service. But HBO was facing a classic dilemma, a classic business dilemma, which is called channel conflict. And that is when there is a strategy that you as a business want to pursue. It's profitable, the customer's demanding it, whatever, it's more sustainable in the long run. There's clear reasons why we know we should do this. But you are in conflict with your channel, meaning your distributor, the way that you deliver your goods to the market currently. And typically, distributors often, or those channels often, have a lot of leverage over you. And so you're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Is we do what would be good for us or good for the customer, or do we do what's good for our channel? And so HBO was really stuck in this situation because it was wholly dependent at that time. Not, a lot of its money comes through in this case, the cable companies was the established legacy distributor. It was all of it, like the whole thing, the whole market, all of its money from the legacy business was coming through the cable companies. And the cable companies said, we don't want you streaming. We don't want any of you guys, any of the networks streaming. So I lay out the story of how they methodically, understanding and this strategic constraints, where they were today and where they wanted to go. In other words, today's value train and the value train they wanted to get to, how they built the case to gain leverage and work around this problem, solve channel conflict, and ultimately be the first. There's a very clear reason they were absolutely the first traditional TV network to launch a streaming service despite that channel conflict barrier, do it successfully, and once they broke the dam, all the others followed. And they followed very quickly. It was clear they had built the technology. They were just scared to launch the products, and they were waiting for HBO. And once HBO pulled it off, they all, in a matter of months, started to launch their own streaming services. So it's a great sort of lesson in competitive strategy and how to think creatively. And hopefully the tool, the value train, will help you think that through yourself as you're thinking about your own next innovative moves in your own business model.
I was thinking about it when I read about it as the Roger Bannister effect for for new platforms as well. The Roger Bannister effect.
No, I
Oh
don't.
man, I was telling my son about this. So the idea was this guy Roger Bannister he was the first guy to break the 4 minute mile, and
Oh,
before that,
okay.
people
Yes.
thought you'd die or your heart would explode. And then within a
Yeah.
few months of him breaking it, 3 more people had broken it, and then there was nothing to break the 4 minute mile.
Seemed doable.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, when you knew it could be done,
Exactly.
somehow that made all the difference.
There's one piece of unfinished business, and it's not asking you where people can find all these tools, which we will in a second. It is what's changed, what hasn't. And before you answer that, I just wanted to quote a beautiful couple of lines from the book that I found. And it was earlier on in the book, actually, but I just thought this talked to the exact spirit of the book. And then I'm going to pass over to you to tell us where people can find you, but also answer this cliffhanger that we set people up with. But you wrote beautifully, the only sure response to a shifting business environment is to take a path of constant evolution, looking to every technology as a way to extend and improve our value proposition to our customers, rather than waiting to adapt when change becomes a matter of life or death. Businesses need to focus on seizing emerging opportunities, divesting from declining sources of advantage, and adapting early to stay ahead of the curve of change. I absolutely love that, man. That was a beautiful line. I'm going to stick that in Goodreads. That's a
Thank
keeper.
you.
So over
Thank
to you
Aidan.
to close, David. Let's start with where people can find you.
Where can people find me? So I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, David Rogers, Rogers. You can find me on my website, davidrogers.digital, not .com or .org, but .digital. And I have a Substack newsletter, which I publish it, periodically, erratically, and you can find that either from the website or right at the top of my LinkedIn as well. So it's easy to find me there. And you can find information on my sequel to the playbook, which was a book called The Digital Transformation Roadmap, and which I talked about. I've got a great 2 sessions talking about this with Aidan on a previous show. And also you can find out about what I have coming up. But to your question of looking back, it's been 10 years since the playbook was published. What's changed? What's the same? Really, when I think of what's changed, the role in a sense has changed. There was an era when I was mostly talking to chief digital officers, heads of digital transformation. That is still the case in a good number of companies, but I do see a transition happening. And what's interesting is I see that digital transformation is now just becoming, I say just, becoming a core leadership job for general managers. This is what I find. The people who are in charge of it, who are coming to me, whether it's taking a class of mine at Columbia Business School or reaching out to me directly to engage me, they're chief operating officers. They're general manager of business unit. They're a CEO, right? It has become, if you're in that kind of a role, strategy, operations, recruiting and developing your talent and people, right? Financial discipline. And one of the core things you do now is also digital transformation, right? It's not the sexy new thing. It's like central to the life of the company. And that sort of ties into the other thing I think that has changed was we have gotten past this idea that this is a project. Oh, we're going to do a transformation and we'll be done in 3 years. And we recognize this is an ongoing job. And it's not a job for just some companies. It's really every industry. This is part of leading and adapting and growing your company for the future, wave after wave of change. Now, what is the same, right? As you said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, I would start back with the very first quote you led off our conversation with, which is digital transformation is not about technology. And that is so true today in the AI era. Is companies, many are, the distinction I would say between those who are getting real enterprise value out of AI and those who are not, is the ones who are thinking about the technology first versus those who are thinking about the business first. The challenge is not about the technology. It's about rethinking your business. reimagining it, redefining it, redesigning it. That's the hard part, right? The tools are amazing, but you're not going to unlock value from them unless you start with a business. So when I see AI today, I see most companies are just obsessed with kind of this first level of value, which is efficiency and operations. Now, of course, you should be doing that. But a lot of companies don't even get past that. They're just thinking about how do I run my current business cheaper and maybe even faster. Right? The better companies are those who are also thinking of what new value could I create for the market? So that's a lot of my thinking now is looking at how do I define the templates of where do we find new sources of value with this new generation of AI? How do we do something we haven't done before? How do we create new value for the market, improving upon our business model as it is? And then an even higher level of change or transformation, or more ambitious, is thinking about how might AI allow us to reimagine and explore new business models, reorganize what we do versus what others do. What part of the business do we operate? What do we outsource? Where is our value train? Going back to that value train, rechanging, what's our position going to be? What are we going to occupy? Where do we add value? Where do we capture value? Where do we partner with others? Where do we operate like a platform? That's the kind of level of thinking that is still required. So this book was all about the playbook was all about how do we do this in the digital era? How do we operate across all of these different levels of change? And that's really continues to be what I'm actually looking at today. And so, as I said, I'm working on my next book. I don't even have a title yet, but it's deep in development. But it is really looking back at those same questions, but through the lens or the context of the current era of AI, which creates all kinds of opportunities, but really brings us back to a lot of those same fundamental challenges of change.
Beautiful. And I have to say, I always learn so much from you, man. And over David's shoulder there, you'll see on his right shoulder, The Network is Your Customer, another gem of a book. I was hoping to get to that next, but it sounds like you might interrupt that pathway and have the new book out as well. These are classics. We've covered before the Digital Transformation Roadmap, and today we cover this beauty. While it's aged, it hasn't aged that much, and all the tools are still extremely valuable. The Digital Transformation Playbook, highly recommended. And the author, once again, David Rogers, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Aidan. It's always a pleasure to be on your show, and I look forward to the next time. All my best.
As always, thank you to our sponsor, Kyndryl, with a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched service capability. Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. Also download the Kyndryl app or Institute app, where you'll find many of the guests who have been on the show, Sanjeet Paul Chowdhury, Rita McGrath, and many others who've written fantastic articles, deep dives on the Kyndryl Institute. You can find both at kyndryl.com/institute.